It looks like he literally aged in reverse at least 10 years. I mean, it is ridiculous the glow up that Dr. Pete had in his in his mid late 40s. Hello everyone, this is Dalton of Analyze and Optimize, and welcome to Metabolic Mastery. Today we're going to be talking about something very near and dear to my heart, and that is pregnenolone. Now, I had my first experience with pregnenolone probably a little bit over a year ago, and it was a topical product, and I don't really remember feeling too much from it at first, but that was until I got thrown into an environment that is normally very stressful for me. So normally, like, I'm kind of to myself, like everything's consistent. But then, if I get put into a situation with people who I may be more prone to having arguments with, then, shit can kind of hit the fan and you can kind of lose your stability. You can lose your cool a bit. And I was very notorious for having that quality of losing my cool throughout my life. But that was until pregnenolone. I was around these individuals who I normally argue with, and we did argue. And even if the subject matter was kind of contentious or there were personal shots taken at me, I kind of just took everything in stride. And I was very balanced and very open-minded and very willing to listen to other people on this. And this was a quality that I kind of lacked sort of my whole life, and it was pretty crazy. I actually remember my mom telling me, like, you seem so much more balanced. Like, you normally would argue back in these situations. And I was like, yeah, you're right. And then I also remember just being in the woods, and it was like I was in Narnia. It was like this magical forest, and I had this insane sense of euphoria and just like connectivity, just peace with myself and with the world around me. And so it was pretty incredible. So I continued using that product for a number of months. And while it still did benefit me, I noticed that, when I would have periods of even worse stress than that it wouldn't always be the same hack. So I was looking to sort of up my dose, or at least find a different way of getting more pregnenolone in my system. And that was when my buddy Nick Stumphauser, shout out to Nick, we did a podcast with him. He's the creator of the famous Died Suddenly. You should check that out on Rumble. But Nick told me that he had used this brand called Health Natura, and it comes as a powder, so you can take it orally or you can take it sublingually. And I started to use it when I was at a very stressful point in my life. I mean, I was literally walking around nervous and anxious. But the pregnenolone just became this, like, I call it the great stabilizer, because it just totally gives you peace of mind, or gave me peace of mind, and just totally obliterated my stress and made me feel like I could really, like, do anything without having that worry, about anything in life, really. So we're fortunate enough to actually have reached out to Health Natura, and I actually got to talk to the owner of Health Natura along with his wife. Great family. They have a great business, and they have probably the best pregnenolone on the market. And pregnenolone is kind of notorious for being hard to come by in its pure and bioidentical form. So the fact that Health Natura has this is really great, and we're very happy to be able to partner with them. So definitely check out Health Natura if you are interested in purchasing and using pregnenolone for yourself. But what is pregnenolone? Well, pregnenolone is basically like the mother of all steroids. So essentially, everyone is familiar with cholesterol, right? It's bad, right? Well, not exactly. So cholesterol. At the beginning of the steroid synthesis pathway, cholesterol is imported into the mitochondria, and then from there, it can get converted into pregnenolone and then other downstream hormones as well. However, this process tends to become impaired as we age due to a number of factors, but mainly because in order to make this enzymatic conversion, which is the rate-limiting step of this whole process, you need certain nutrients, fat-soluble vitamins, B vitamins, and you need good mitochondrial function, which, as we age, tends to decline. And mitochondrial dysfunction, poor mitochondrial function, is pretty much synonymous with aging and disease in any context. So I think that this is actually probably one of the reasons why cholesterol, like having high cholesterol, is kind of demonized or looked at as a bad thing. And that's probably because if you have a high cholesterol, you have a low metabolic rate, and you're not getting conversion into these downstream hormones, which, as we'll discuss, can be very health promoting in a variety of ways. So that brings us a little bit to the narratives around aging, and today it's very interesting. You have all these like biohacker guys trying to do a number of different things, but it seems to revolve around this idea. Number one, about these sort of longevity genes that if they're activated, they make animals live longer or worms live longer or whatever. You also have the stance of caloric restriction. This comes down to metabolic slowdown. The idea is your heart has a number of beats, your body has a set limit of energy that it can expend over a lifetime, and then once that's used up, you're toast. And this kind of spawns a lot of the narratives about caloric restriction being a good thing because it slows down your metabolism and that'll slow down your aging. In reality, in my opinion, I don't think anything could really be further from the truth. And even if that was true, would you want to live like a tortoise for 100 years or like a lion for 60? I think everyone would prefer a higher quality of life, even if it's for a shorter time. But the good thing is that I don't believe that narrative is necessarily true, and that's its own whole topic. But if we look at actual signs of aging in human beings, what do you see? You see stress and you see a decline in energy. The stress tends to manifest as, mood effects. It tends to manifest as catabolism. Your structure breaks down, your tissue breaks down, you have less muscle, your skin becomes wrinkly, all these different things that ultimately come down to a breakdown of tissue, which is synonymous with stress hormones. And in fact, one study I posted on Twitter the other day actually showed that the levels of the so-called stress hormone, cortisol, actually reliably predicts how young people will perceive you as. So if you have a high cortisol level and you ask a random person on the street, they're going to think that you're older than someone your age, but with a lower amount of cortisol and thus a lower amount of stress. That's how important these processes are. And to me, that is much more closely associated with actual aging, as opposed to these kind of ideas about caloric restriction and certain genes and take metformin and all these things. I think that we should be aiming to really regain our youth. That is a more productive way of thinking about anti-aging things. So to go along with that, DHEA, which is a metabolite of pregnenolone, the ratio of DHEA to cortisol is a very reliable predictor of all-cause mortality. That is to say, the higher your cortisol is relative to your DHEA, which essentially serves as a proxy for steroid hormones in general, the higher your cortisol is relative to these other protective steroid hormones, basically the greater at risk you are for heart disease, the greater at risk you are for any condition you can name, as well as just longevity in general. And then on top of that, we do know that there is a decline in the production of these hormones as you age. There's also a decline in the structure and the function of your mitochondria, which ironically is where these steroids are produced. So this has kind of become iconic at this point, but Ray Peat in his book, Generative Energy, detailed his experience with pregnenolone. And, I'll just put up the pictures on the screen here, but basically he was in like his mid to late 40s and he realized that he had a good source of pregnenolone on him and he started taking it like every day. It looks like he literally aged in reverse at least 10 years. I mean, it is ridiculous, the glow up that Dr. Peat had in his mid-late 40s. It's actually ridiculous. And this kind of goes hand in hand with what we were talking about physical aging and cortisol and stress. But what exactly does pregnenolone have to do with stress? Well, I think that pregnenolone is your body's primary endogenous way of lowering stress. It's your body's primary anti-stress compound. Now, I'm coining that term that's not been recognized by the medical establishment, but I'll explain why I think that. Essentially, in order to understand stress, we need to understand the HPA axis a little bit, or the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis, just a little bit. So in your brain, you have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, in response to stress, whatever that may be, produces a hormone called CRH, or corticotropin-releasing hormone. Then CRH travels to the pituitary gland, which is also near your brain, And once it hits the pituitary gland, it produces a hormone called ACTH, or adrenocorticotropin hormone. Once ACTH hits the adrenal glands, then it produces cortisol, which is the quintessential stress hormone that people like to refer to as the stress hormone, even though there's obviously more. And normally your body has this mechanism in place where, the cortisol is released, and then in order to not have it just go on forever, the cortisol will inhibit the hypothalamus's production of CRH. And that's in order to keep this whole system sort of in check. However, with age and in diseases, researchers have noticed that there's what's called a disinhibition. So essentially you don't get the inhibition. So you have a net more CRH and more ACTH, even though cortisol may still be elevated because you're not getting that negative feedback loop. And this is a huge problem for a variety of reasons. And while cortisol is typically considered the stress hormone, CRH and ACTH may actually be worse in their own ways. These hormones have been associated with a number of different conditions. CRH is actually one of the primary drivers of intestinal pathologies like IBS and intestinal permeability, what is now known as leaky gut. So it kind of just goes to show that these hormones, even if your cortisol is low, if your CRH and your ACTH are high, you're still probably not going to be in a good state in terms of your overall stress and your health. However, when ACTH hits the adrenals normally, the adrenals can also produce pregnenolone in response to the ACTH. And I think that this is, again, another mechanism that's in place in order to keep the system in check, because as it turns out, pregnenolone is the most potent endogenous inhibitor of CRH release, meaning that not only are you lowering cortisol, you're also lowering ACTH and CRH, inhibiting this entire cascade at its source. You are effectively targeting stress at the most basic root cause, besides just not having stress in your life, which is essentially impossible. The other thing about pregnenolone is that it can get converted into two other steroids that have independent anti-stress effects. The first is progesterone, which is pretty famous at this point, but progesterone also has anti-glucocorticoid activities, meaning that it basically blocks the signaling of cortisol at the level of your tissues. It also has anti-estrogenic effects, and we're going to have a video coming up all about the harms of estrogen pretty soon. And it can have what are called GABAergic effects. So GABA is this compound in the brain that essentially makes you very relaxed, and it's responsible for that kind of nice chill feeling that you get if you, have a glass of wine or something. And then the other compound that pregnenolone can metabolize into that has its own independent anti-stress effects is something called allopregnenolone. And allopregnenolone not only has the GABAergic effects that progesterone does as well, but it also has direct anti-cortisol effects. So you're getting like a 5 times whammy of anti-stress properties at the very root cause when you have enough pregnenolone in the system. Another interesting thing about pregnenolone is that, unlike progesterone, it does not directly antagonize the glucocorticoid or the cortisol receptors on your cells, but it essentially does the same thing in that it doesn't block the receptor, but it essentially prevents the receptor from going where it needs to go in the cell in order to actually do anything. So that is like 6 different independent mechanisms by which pregnenolone and its metabolites are anti-stress. And this is why I believe it's really the body's primary anti-stress compound that is produced, in times when it's needed. Like I mentioned, red wine or alcohol in general is something that affects the GABA system, but a lot of drugs that make you feel relaxed have a GABAergic effect on the brain, which is part of, I think, why people may crave them, because they kind of crave that feeling of relaxation or the GABA. Another thing that a lot of these drugs actually do is increase your brain levels of pregnenolone. It increases the amount of pregnenolone that your body produces. So it should be no surprise at that point that pregnenolone administration has actually been shown as therapeutic in certain, cases of addiction. I think alcohol and cocaine have been shown in the literature. Another thing that pregnenolone does, interestingly, is that it actually blocks the cannabinoid 1 receptor. And this is responsible for a lot of, marijuana's effects, cannabis. But the CB1 receptor is actually pretty popular drug target because blocking that receptor seems to have anti-obesity effects. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why excess consumption of polyunsaturated fats drive obesity, is because they are able to act through this CB1 receptor. And it kind of should explain why people seem to seek out certain drugs, because they may have a GABAergic or a pro-pregnenolone effect, but you can just get those same benefits by taking the pregnenolone itself. So let's talk about inflammation a little bit. So inflammation is obviously present in every aging disease state that you can possibly think of. And it's very popular to talk about, but the root causes of inflammation seem to be a bit kind of mysterious in this space, but in my opinion, there are two. The first is excessive consumption of polyunsaturated fats, like things like vegetable oil. That drives inflammation through a number of different mechanisms that I don't need to get into here. And then the other one that tends to be a chronic source of inflammation is actually your gut. Things, again, like a leaky gut, where particles from the gut can actually get into the bloodstream, and that can cause all sorts of systemic inflammation. And that seems to be present in pretty much any disease that you can think of as well. Now, why am I bringing this all up? It's because there is a receptor that specifically recognizes bacteria in the intestine and throughout the body. This family of receptors is called the toll-like receptors, or TLR. TLR2 and TLR4 are probably the most important in terms of sensing bacteria in the intestine, but as well as elsewhere in the body. So pregnenolone has the very unique capability of actually degrading this receptor, and that in turn prevents this systemic inflammatory response. And this is huge because, again, this pathway is present in so many conditions, not even just intestinal dysfunctions, but things like autoimmunity. Most chronic diseases are actually diseases of inflammation. And pregnenolone targets one of the most basic and important mechanisms of generating inflammation, which is those TLR receptors. Now, I know you may be thinking, I don't want to take an exogenous hormone because it's not natural and it's going to shut down my own production. So to address that first point, it actually doesn't get more natural than interacting with exogenous hormones in the environment. I mean, literally every day we are exposed to pheromones from other individuals. We are exposed to, consumer products like plastic, clothing, and then that's not even to get into the food, the medications. All these things either have bioactive hormones or hormone mimicking substances that our body is constantly interacting with. So does it really matter if this is an exogenous hormone that you're taking? I don't believe that to be the case, especially when a lot of these pernicious hormones or hormone-like substances that are in the environment are net negative on our physiology. So why does it matter if you take an exogenous hormone, something that can actually protect you instead of harm you? You should be able to do that. Now, in terms of suppression, I think that this is probably a risk when you're talking about more downstream hormones like testosterone. But in terms of pregnenolone, I think it actually has the opposite effect. Since it is produced in the mitochondria, requires good mitochondrial function in order to produce, and pregnenolone actually supports your mitochondria, this can actually become a positive feedback loop. So essentially, there's a process called mitochondrial fusion, where mitochondria can come together and then basically form a massive, giant energy-producing mitochondria that's very robust and associated with very good health. Or you could have the opposite, which is mitochondrial fragmentation. Fragmentation is exactly what it sounds like. It's breaking down your mitochondria so that they don't produce energy as well. However, it's been shown that cells that are manipulated to produce more pregnenolone actually produce more energy in the mitochondria. And to go on top of that, they are partially responsible for initiating that mitochondrial fusion process. So this is all to say that you need energy to produce pregnenolone, and you need pregnenolone to produce energy. So by taking pregnenolone exogenously, you are not really risking shutting down the system or damaging it. In fact, you're doing the very opposite. You're supporting it. And this kind of brings us into the greater picture of neuroprotection. So I mentioned before that pregnenolone actually can increase the amount of energy that your mitochondria produce. And these effects are most apparent in the brain because the brain uses the most energy of any organ, obviously. So the first major impact that pregnenolone can have on your brain is that it supports a process called myelination. Basically, everyone's seen what a neuron looks like. It's basically like a head with like a leg on it. And that leg has this coating, this like lipid coating on it, and that's called myelin or myelin sheath. That coating is very important for the proper firing and the functioning of that neuron. And things that support myelination are generally neuroprotective, whereas a decrease in the amount of myelin or demyelination is seen in aging and disease. However, it's been shown that pregnenolone can actually support the process of myelination, which is huge. Another structural impact that it has on the brain is what are called microtubules. Now, typically we think of tissues as just being like clumps of cells, and obviously that's true to an extent, but you also have the extracellular environment. And the extracellular environment is comprised of all these different proteins and different kind of just structure that holds the tissues and makes you really, instead of just a clump of cells. And one of those is what are called microtubules. And I'll put some pictures on the screen because I think it's really cool to look at them. But they essentially help lock in place cells, and they allow them to move in basically in sync and to where they need to go properly. So the microtubules play an overall huge role in cell health and any tissue health, but especially in the brain. And again, pregnenolone actually supports the formation and the structure of the microtubules, which is just incredible. But what's even more incredible is that pregnenolone actually allows your stem cells, your neural stem cells, to proliferate. So I'm sure you're all familiar with like some older like rich guy who had back pain and then he got like a stem cell injection into his back and it's like a miracle cure. That's because stem cells are basically like baby cells. And these sort of baby cells can then go on to differentiate into a number of different types of cells. So obviously a neural stem cell can differentiate into any type of different neuron. And pregnenolone can actually support the proliferation of these stem cells. That is to say that it supports the growth of new brain cells indirectly. Again, which is incredible because if you look in cognitive decline or in Alzheimer's disease, you can see structural breakdown of the actual brain tissue. And pregnenolone is something that could potentially support that process, which is huge. Another thing is that allopregnenolone, that metabolite of pregnenolone that I was talking about before, actually acts as a pro-dopamine and anti-serotonin signaling molecule. And I don't need to get into all that. We talked about that last time, but I just thought I'd throw that in there. And this all seems to culminate in the primary effects of pregnenolone, which are an elevated mood and just better cognitive function, better learning. There have been a number of different human studies that demonstrate these effects very well. So one condition that pregnenolone has been tried for is schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is characteristic as having a lower dopamine and a higher serotonin state, as well as a number of different cognitive problems, obviously. But pregnenolone seems to sort of stabilize that whole process again, which is pretty insane. I mentioned arthritis before, as well as other sort of chronic inflammatory conditions, but pregnenolone has an excellent track record of treating arthritis. At least it used to. I mean, nowadays, drug companies don't really care about pregnenolone because they can't patent it or really make money off of it. But these older studies from like the 40s, 50s, 60s did show tremendous benefit in arthritis using pregnenolone supplements. And I want to just point out one quote from one of these old manuscripts real quick. It says, "We've had communications from a number of investigators to the effect that when 300 milligrams per day failed to induce a favorable response in rheumatoid arthritis, doses of 400, 500, and even 600 milligrams of pregnenolone per day were given and were followed by clinical benefit in some of the patients. Thus, it is not possible at this time to establish the upper limit of useful dosage. It appears, moreover, that very large doses can be employed without danger of side effects." And that brings up a couple of key points, but mainly is that you may need quite a bit of pregnenolone if you have some pretty serious stress that you want to handle. One thing about pregnenolone is that it's not very well orally absorbed, which is why sometimes I'll do sublingual administration with the pregnenolone powder. But if you want to take it orally, and that is my preferred method, you may need pretty large doses because not a ton of it is absorbed. And that can be why in certain situations people don't experience benefit from pregnenolone. But I think just playing around with the dose is very important. And again, we'll get into the safety a little bit more later, but it's really not something that people should be concerned about in terms of being unsafe in general. So to go along with all of this, these older studies, I think they studied like coal miners or something, but basically in exercise and in just like manual labor, pregnenolone showed a huge benefit in terms of subjective like anti-fatigue effects. And this is really good for me right now because I actually just recorded this entire video, all like 45 minutes of it, and then I forgot that my mic was turned on, and I'm making sure that it's turned on now. But if that happened to me before pregnenolone, I would have lost my mind and I probably would have gone and taken a nap. But now I just turned around and I'm making the video again anyway, kind of like it's nothing. So that kind of shows the anti-fatigue effects of pregnenolone right there. But it has been studied formally. One very interesting effect that pregnenolone seems to have is its effect on emotions. And they did at least a few studies on this where they showed that the emotion center of the brain, called the amygdala, actually has less connectivity to your higher cognitive thinking brain regions under the influence of pregnenolone. And that is to say that your greater perspective on life will not be as impacted by negative emotions when using pregnenolone. And in fact, the subjects even said that they had less negative affectivity, or they just kind of felt less bad about their emotions compared to how they normally will. And because of this, it's also shown some benefit in even things like bipolar depression, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. So in terms of dosing pregnenolone for a given response, it seems like the lower doses, so like under 100 milligrams orally, it seems like that seems to be more converted into androgens like testosterone, DHT, DHEA, which we mentioned earlier. It seems like the lower doses seem to favor that pathway. Now, you're always going to get some conversion into allopregnenolone and progesterone, and by some, I mean most of the pregnenolone. If it doesn't stay in the form of pregnenolone, it's going to get converted into allop or into progesterone most likely. But at the lower doses, it seems to favor the androgenic pathways more. But if you keep cranking up the dose, it seems like it either is going to stay as pregnenolone or it's going to get converted more into progesterone and into allop. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if you are a male and you're experiencing like lower libido when you take high doses of pregnenolone, that is probably it. Not that progesterone has like this feminizing effect, but it is anti-androgenic to an extent. It seems like this is really transient, especially in my experience. Like if I ever had to take like a large dose of pregnenolone, like a gram of pregnenolone or something, if I was really freaking out about something, yeah, like I wouldn't be interested in sex like that day, but it's not like it would just go away forever. I mean, it returns very, very quickly. So it's really a transient thing. The other interesting thing is that in animal and human studies, the older ones, they actually showed that pregnenolone prevented testicular atrophy and actually increased testicle size and sperm production. And not to be disgusting, but that is actually something that I've experienced as well. I can. It's actually one of the first things that I noticed when I started taking it. I was like, whoa. Anyway, pregnenolone can also technically serve as a precursor to estrogen and to cortisol. And we've kind of said that these are hormones that you really want to keep under control. So why am I telling you to take a precursor? Well, because of the aforementioned effects that they actually functionally antagonize these hormones. Cortisol, I don't believe I need to explain any further. But in terms of estrogen, pregnenolone has functional anti-estrogenic effects, and its conversion into progesterone is your primary endogenous anti-estrogen compound. So I really wouldn't be worried about excessive conversion into estrogen from pregnenolone. But the conversion into progesterone, if you're a male, is at least something I would be aware of at the higher doses. Now, in terms of risks, I think that one number really just sticks out in my head, and this is from that 1950 review that I was referring to earlier, and that's that they gave rodents up to 5 grams of pregnenolone per kilogram of body weight. So let's say you're a $150 as a guy, that would be 350 grams of pregnenolone, which would be like this much pregnenolone. Still nothing bad would happen based on these animal experiments. They noted nothing harmful to these animals. And in the human studies, that seems to be corroborated. I think if anything, if you're having problems with pregnenolone, I would really just be sure to check the sourcing of your pregnenolone. I mean, a lot of these supplements have bad additives in them, or they don't actually have pregnenolone, or they have like a pregnenolone acetate, which is not what you want. Which is, again, why I'm such a big fan of the Health Natura brand, because it is so pure, and I know that it works. But yeah, that's going to wrap it up for today. Make sure you subscribe. If you got a question, make sure to hit us up on Patreon. We will give you a nice written out response if you got a question about anything. Follow us on Twitter. Follow us on Instagram. Be sure to check out Health Natura as well as all of our other products, which we'll link below. And yeah, what else can I say? Don't let them fool you. See you next time.